On Easter Sunday, 1843, in the tidewater lowlands of Virginia, the bells of Christ's resurrection tolled, while a plantation house burned with its master's family still inside. The fire, born not from accident but from vengeance, carried the name of its author, Margaret, an enslaved woman who had turned the holy day into a trial by flame. The fields around the estate smelled of wet soil and smoke, but closer to the big house, the air reeked of charred flesh and pine pitch. Chains hung in the quarters like dead vines. The dirt paths between cabins bore the memory of decades of blood and lash. Even the cypress trees leaned inward as though listening to the screams that had lived in the soil. Margaret was 30, broad-shouldered from years of cutting tobacco, her palms hardened like bark. She had been born on this land, baptized in its church, whipped in its yard. The master, Colonel Matthew Rawls, prided himself on running his plantation like scripture. His word was the Old Testament, his punishments the book of Revelation. He quoted the Bible while the overseer split backs open, whispering that obedience was God's demand. In the slave quarters, Margaret carried a wound that did not heal. 2 winters earlier, her daughter, 8 years old, had been taken into the house to serve. The girl's hands were small and clumsy, her body too frail for labor. She lasted 3 months before being found lifeless behind the smokehouse. The master's wife claimed she had fallen ill. The slaves whispered another story, that the girl had been used, broken, and silenced. Margaret buried her child in a shallow grave near the swamp, the soil still soft from rain. She laid a stone over the mound and never wept again. Something in her gaze hardened into steel. By 1843, the master's paranoia had begun to spread. Nat Turner's rebellion still haunted Virginia's gentry, and the mere sight of slaves whispering at dusk was enough to bring lash or noose. Guards prowled the quarters, listening for plots, but they could not hear everything. Margaret had learned silence as a weapon. She whispered in corners, at the well, near the graveyard where old bones shifted in the clay. She gathered 3 others: Isaac, a crippled blacksmith, whose son had been sold south; Ruth, a young woman forced nightly into the master's bed; and old Jonah, who claimed he could read omens in fire. They met under moonless skies. Jonah spoke of dreams where fields burned without end. Ruth swore she saw blood in the well water. Margaret listened, then spoke the words none dared. Easter, the day he kneels before his God, we will make him kneel before us. The plan was simple and merciless. Isaac forged small blades from discarded horseshoes. Ruth smuggled lamp oil from the big house. Jonah marked the spots where the wooden walls were weakest, where fire would run quickest. They swore no escape, only destruction. If death followed, it was freedom's price. In the weeks before Easter, Margaret walked the plantation like a shadow. She endured lashes without flinching, bowed her head when ordered, but inside she rehearsed the fire. At night she dreamed of her daughter's grave glowing red, the earth whispering, "Burn them." On the eve of the holy day, Rawls ordered the slaves to prepare a great feast. Chickens bled in the dirt. Smoke filled the kitchen. Hymns drifted from the parlor. Margaret moved among the pots, her face blank, her hands calm, but her eyes fixed on the candles flickering along the walls. She saw not light but torches. When the church bell rang that Easter morning, Rawls and his family gathered in their Sunday best, praising resurrection. By nightfall, resurrection meant nothing. Margaret struck the first match. The night of Easter, 1843, fell heavy over the Rawls plantation. The air damp with spring rain and thick with the smell of cut pine. The enslaved moved about their tasks as if nothing stirred beneath the surface. Yet in the slave quarters, silence was no longer submission. It was the tightening of a bowstring before release. Margaret sat on her cot, the rough boards pressing against her spine, staring at the small knife Isaac had forged. The blade was crude, jagged where the metal had refused to bend, but it was enough. She tied it to her leg with a strip of cloth. Her hands no longer trembled. Her daughter's face, pale in memory, was the only prayer she carried. Isaac, limping from the old iron burn that had crippled him years before, whispered instructions. "Oil's ready. Jonah will set the shed first. The smoke will draw them to the window. That's when we move." His voice was hoarse, scraped raw by years at the forge. He had lost his only boy to the auction block in New Orleans, and he spoke now like a man who had nothing left to lose. Ruth, barely 20, her arms covered in faded bruises, clutched a flask of lamp oil against her chest. She had spent too many nights in the colonel's bed, her body used like linen, discarded in the morning. Her eyes gleamed with a hatred that no whip could scour. "I'll be the one to serve him his last drink," she said, her lips curling into something between a sneer and a sob. Old Jonah sat apart, staring into the dirt floor as if reading a book only he could see. He traced patterns with his finger, muttering of fire and bones. "The earth has waited," he said. "The earth will eat tonight." The great house loomed in the distance, its whitewashed walls glowing ghostly in the moonlight. From its windows spilled the laughter of the Rawls family. They feasted on lamb and wine, celebrating the day of resurrection, while those who served them lived in graves without markers. The overseer, a man named Collins, prowled the yard with his whip coiled at his belt, barking at shadows. He was the first name on Margaret's tongue. When the clock struck 9, the plan unfurled. Jonah limped toward the shed, his hands shaking as he tipped the first flask of oil into the straw. The flame caught quick, hungry. In moments, smoke billowed upward, dark against the pale sky. Dogs barked. Collins cursed and strode toward the blaze. He didn't see Isaac behind him until the knife slit his throat. The sound was wet, muffled, and the overseer staggered like a felled ox, his whip falling useless into the dirt. Margaret moved then. She and Ruth slipped into the house, blending with the noise of servants clearing dishes. The dining room stank of roasted meat and spilled wine. Colonel Rawls sat at the head of the table, his white beard stained with grease, his Bible resting beside his plate as though Scripture could sanctify his hunger. His wife dabbed her lips with linen, their 2 sons loud with drunken hymns. Ruth poured his glass, her hands steady. The colonel raised it high, ready to toast Christ risen. That was when Margaret struck. The knife flashed once, burying itself into the throat of the elder son. Blood sprayed across the white cloth, splattering the Scripture. Chaos roared. The younger son leapt to his feet, but Isaac, limping in through the door, buried his jagged blade deep into the man's belly. Rawls himself froze, stunned, his hand trembling around the goblet. His eyes met Margaret's, and for the first time in 30 years, he did not see a servant. He saw judgment. She spoke only once, her voice low and flat. "You killed my child." Ruth flung the oil across the table, the flames leaping to life as candles toppled. The feast turned into a pyre. The master's wife screamed, the walls groaned with fire, and the enslaved outside gathered in silence, watching the house that had devoured them begin to devour itself. Margaret stood in the blaze, her face lit orange, her knife red, and for a single breath she felt the chains fall away. The fire spread as though the land itself had waited for this night. Resin-soaked pine beams groaned. Glass shattered. Curtains flared like funeral shrouds. The Rawls plantation house, that monument to cruelty in Scripture, became a furnace. Margaret dragged the colonel from the dining hall before the flames swallowed it whole. His boots scraped the floor, his Bible slipping from his hand into the spreading fire. Outside, the enslaved had gathered in the yard, their faces lit in shifting red. Some clutched hoes or sharpened stakes, others only stood in silence, eyes fixed on the man who had ruled their bodies and souls. Isaac and Ruth flung the 2 dead sons onto the porch, their blood steaming in the fire's heat. The colonel's wife wailed inside, her cries smothered as the roof collapsed. No one moved to save her. No one spoke a prayer. Margaret forced Rawls to his knees in the dirt, his fine linen coat smeared with ash. The overseer's whip lay nearby, coiled like a snake without a master. For the first time in his life, Rawls faced a crowd of his slaves not as property, but as judges. His breath came ragged, his face streaked with soot. "You think this saves you?" he rasped, voice breaking between coughs. "The militia will come. By morning you'll hang on these gates." Isaac stepped forward, the crude knife still in his hand. His voice was gravel. "So be it. But tonight you hang first." The circle tightened. Children, women, old men, faces marked by lash scars and hunger watched without flinching. Old Jonah raised his hands, his cracked voice cutting through the roar of fire. "We bring charges." His words trembled like prophecy. "For the backs split open, for the children sold, for the bodies buried without names. For every Easter he prayed while we bled." Ruth's voice shook but did not falter. "For the nights he made me crawl into his bed like a dog." A murmur rose from the crowd, a sound like thunder held in throats too long. Margaret bent low, her face inches from the colonel's. His eyes darted, searching for mercy. She gave him none. "Your God won't hear you," she said. "The earth already has." Isaac swung first. The blade cut deep across Rawls's cheek, not enough to kill, enough to strip him of the dignity he prized. Ruth followed, pouring the last of the lamp oil over his chest. He screamed, the sound high and thin, nothing like the voice that had barked commands for decades. Jonah lit a torch from the burning house and thrust it into the colonel's hands. "You carried the fire to us. Now carry it to yourself." The old man dropped it, cowering, and the flame licked at his clothes. Margaret did not wait. She shoved him backward into the burning debris of his own home. His screams rose, then cracked, then ended, swallowed by the roar of the fire. The enslaved stood silent. Some wept, not from grief but from a release too vast for words. Others turned to the fields, already alight where sparks had jumped to the dry cane. Flames ran like veins through the earth, devouring the symbols of bondage. The plantation was no longer a place. It was a pyre, a trial, a burial. Margaret stood at its center, the fire reflected in her eyes. For the first time since the shallow grave of her daughter, she felt the world answer back. The Rawls plantation did not die quietly. The fire leapt from beam to beam, shrieking as timber collapsed into glowing heaps. Sparks shot into the night sky and drifted into the cane fields, where dry stalks caught like paper. Soon the entire horizon glowed red. The enslaved gathered in the yard, faces orange in the light, eyes wide but unafraid. They had been taught to bow their heads, to whisper yes sir and no sir. But now they stood upright, watching the master's world fall into ash. Margaret felt the heat on her face, sweat and soot running down her cheeks. She had no tears left. Isaac leaned on his knife like a cane, his breath ragged. Ruth's hands shook, though not with fear but with release. Old Jonah raised his arms toward the blaze and shouted words no white man had ever forced from him. This is the Lord's fire, not his. The earth remembers, and the earth answers. Children clung to their mothers, staring at the inferno. Some laughed. High, wild, confused at first, then growing louder, almost joyful. For the first time, they did not hear the overseer's whip or the colonel's bark. They heard only fire. The great house collapsed inward with a thunderous crack. A column of sparks soared upward, scattering embers across the fields. The colonel's wife screamed once more before the roof fell on her. The sound cut off sharp. Silence followed, broken only by flames. No one moved to help. Margaret turned away from the ruin. She walked to the quarters, the cabins of rough-hewn logs that stank of mildew and old blood. She kicked open the doors, one by one, until the slaves inside poured out. Some were too stunned to move at first, blinking at the sight of the master's house burning like a beacon. Others dropped to their knees in the dirt, whispering prayers they had never dared to speak aloud. Stand, Margaret told them. Her voice was not loud, but it carried. Tonight we are not bowed. Isaac began breaking open the storehouse with his hammer, scattering sacks of cornmeal, barrels of salt pork, iron tools. Take what feeds you, he said. What chained us we burn. Ruth walked to the stables. She struck the lantern against the wall and flung it into the straw. Horses screamed, bolting into the night, their hooves like thunder on the dirt. They would never again carry masters across these fields. The enslaved followed her lead. Torches lit, flames cast into barns, fences, and sheds. The plantation became a circle of fire, an ending written in smoke. At the edge of the field, Jonah knelt and pressed his palms into the soil. His lips moved in prayer, but his words were not Christian hymns. They were older, earthbound, whispered to ancestors whose bones lay unmarked beneath the crops. Drink now, he murmured. Drink their blood. Drink their pride. Margaret stood still amid the chaos, her chest heaving. She thought of her daughter, of the small stone marking a grave too shallow, and for the first time she did not feel powerless before it. The child would not grow, but her death had grown into fire. By midnight the Rawls plantation was no more, only fire, ash, and the smell of burning cane. The enslaved huddled near the swamp's edge, faces streaked with soot, bodies trembling not from fear but from something new. Freedom, sharp and fleeting as lightning. Yet freedom carried a shadow. In the distance the dogs barked. From the county road came the faint thud of hooves, soldiers summoned by neighbors who had seen the sky blaze red. Isaac spat into the dirt. They're coming. Margaret tightened the cloth around her knife, then let them find nothing but ash. The rebels vanished into the swamp, carrying scraps of food, tools, children on their backs. Behind them the flames roared higher, a funeral for the old order. And for one night, one burning, unholy night, the enslaved of Rawls plantation walked without chains. The militia came before dawn. Lanterns swayed on horseback. Dogs strained against leashes, and the clatter of rifles carried through the trees. Word had spread fast. The Rawls plantation was gone. The colonel dead with his sons, his house reduced to a smoldering heap. In taverns across the county, white planters whispered of rebellion, of Nat Turner's ghost rising again. Fear turned to fury, and fury rode with iron and powder into the swamps. Margaret and her band had gone to ground in the Blackwater Marsh, a place where cypress knees rose like gravestones, and the air hung heavy with rot. Mosquitoes whined, frogs croaked, and roots tangled like chains beneath the surface. To outsiders it was hell. To the fugitives it was sanctuary. They moved barefoot, silent, carrying only what they had taken from the storehouse: salt pork, meal, knives, and a few stolen pistols. Children clung to their mothers, whispering into their necks. Every rustle of cane, every ripple of water felt like a warning. Isaac, limping worse than ever, walked last, dragging a sack of tools across the mud. Ruth carried a boy barely old enough to walk, his face pressed to her shoulder. Jonah muttered to himself, dipping his fingers in the swamp water, leaving streaks of mud across his cheeks like war paint. Margaret moved at the front, knife tied to her leg, her eyes fixed on paths no white man would dare tread. By mid-morning, the sound of dogs reached them, first distant, then closer, a chorus of baying that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The children began to cry. Ruth hushed them, pressing her palm over small mouths. "Quiet now, quiet." Her own breath came fast. "They'll track us," Isaac said. His voice was flat, without panic. "Not in here," Margaret answered. "The water will eat the scent." But even as she spoke, she saw the truth. Blood trailed them. Isaac's wound reopened in the night, left drops dark as ink on the leaves. They hid under a fallen cypress as the first riders entered the swamp. The dogs whined and pulled at their chains, paws splashing. Lanterns cast pale halos on the black water. The men's voices carried, angry, impatient. "We'll gut every one of them. Leave 'em hanging at the crossroads." Margaret held her breath. She pressed her palm to Ruth's arm, steadying her. Isaac gripped his knife though his hand shook. The boy in Ruth's arms whimpered once, too soft for most ears, but not for the dogs. They barked, straining, and the riders shouted. The swamp erupted with noise. "Run," Margaret hissed. They scattered into the trees. Gunfire cracked, loud and sharp, muzzle flashes tearing through the dark. Bullets ripped bark, splintered wood. Water churned as hooves pounded after them. Ruth stumbled, nearly falling with the boy in her arms, but Isaac seized her elbow and dragged her forward. Behind them, Jonah turned, arms raised, shouting words no one understood. A shot rang, and his body fell sideways into the water with a hollow splash. The swamp swallowed him whole. Margaret did not look back. She led them deeper, where the ground turned soft and the water rose waist-high. The riders hesitated at the edge. Dogs barked, but would not enter. The men cursed, firing blindly into the trees, their bullets hissing into the dark. Then they pulled back, vowing to wait them out. For 2 days the rebels hid in the swamp. Hunger gnawed, mosquitoes bled them, and the children whimpered in the dark. Isaac's wound festered, the flesh around it blackening. Ruth tore strips of cloth to bind it, whispering prayers. Margaret spoke little. She sat apart, staring into the water, her reflection broken by ripples. She knew the militia would not leave. They would starve them, circle them, burn them out if they must. On the third night, they heard drums. Not African drums, not the whispers of memory, but the steady roll of militia patrols moving along the road. Lanterns glowed like a wall of fireflies at the swamp's edge. Trapped. Isaac pushed the knife into Margaret's hand. His breath rattled. "Don't let them take you," he said. "Don't let them take her." His eyes flicked toward Ruth, toward the boy she carried. "End it first." Then he lay back, staring up at the cypress canopy. By dawn he was gone, his body sinking slowly into the mud. When the soldiers finally pushed deeper, Margaret did not run. She rose from the water, shoulders squared, knife gleaming. She looked like a figure carved from the swamp itself, mud-streaked, gaunt but unbroken. The men surrounded her, rifles leveled, dogs snapping at their leashes. One officer called out, "On your knees, wench." Margaret did not kneel. She lifted the knife high, her voice steady as steel. "You burned us for centuries. Tonight we burned back." The shot struck her chest. She staggered but did not fall. Another cracked, then another. Still she stood, blood running down her dress, eyes fixed on the men as though judging them in silence. Only when the fourth shot tore through her throat did she collapse into the water. Her body was dragged to the road and hung at the crossroads beside Ruth and the boy. The militia left them swaying, a warning to others. But the warning did not work as they hoped. Travelers whispered. Slaves carried the story in secret. They called it the Easter fire. They said the swamp still echoed with Margaret's last words, that flames rose on Easter night no matter the weather, that the earth itself remembered. The Rawls plantation was never rebuilt. Where it had stood, only blackened earth and weeds remained, a scar across the land. And though her body swung from the gallows, Margaret of Virginia became something larger, a shadow in the hearts of masters, a spark in the dreams of the enslaved. They buried Margaret in silence, not beneath earth, but above it, nailed to the memory of the crossroads. The militia left her body swaying there for days, the sun blackening her skin, crows tearing at her face. They wanted the spectacle to burn itself into the minds of every enslaved man and woman in the county. This is what comes of fire. This is what comes of revolt. Yet the spectacle turned to something else. At night, the enslaved from nearby plantations crept to the crossroads, leaving scraps of cloth, cornmeal, or whispered prayers beneath her hanging feet. Some said they saw her eyes still open, glassy in the moonlight, watching the road. Others swore that when the wind rose, the creaking rope sounded like words, not surrender, but warning. The planters tried to erase it. Newspapers in Richmond called it a house fire accident, never printing Margaret's name. County records marked her as Negro female, property destroyed. Preachers thundered that Satan had seized weak souls, that God had punished them rightly. But no lie could silence the story that passed mouth to mouth, night to night, in cabins and fields. The enslaved told it low, sometimes no more than a murmur, sometimes as a chant. Margaret was no longer just a woman, she was the Easter fire. Children grew up hearing that she had stood before the Master's Bible and struck him down anyway. They whispered that she had walked into the swamp with flames on her shoulders, that the soldiers who killed her never slept again. Some said her knife had not fallen into the mud but had vanished, waiting to be found by another hand. In the swamps, runaways claimed to see her shadow. Hunters reported torches flickering where no men were. And in the cane fields, on Easter nights the stalks sometimes caught fire without lightning, smoke rising in thin black fingers into the sky. White planters shivered, calling it coincidence, but the enslaved knew better. They said it was Margaret, reminding the earth that blood had been spilled and that chains could break again. Ruth's boy, though she died with him in her arms, became part of the legend. Some whispered he lived, that Ruth had thrust him into another woman's hands before the soldiers dragged her away. In Georgia, in Carolina, people told stories of a child who carried his mother's fire in his eyes. The masters tried to stamp out such talk, but the story walked faster than patrols, traveled quicker than hounds. By the 1850s, more than one uprising plan invoked her name. In whispered councils, men drew knives across their palms and swore by Margaret's fire. Some believed that if they fell in revolt, their spirits would meet her in the swamp, where she waited, knife in hand. Even after the Civil War, when slavery's chains were broken, but its shadow stretched long, freedmen still spoke of her. The old ones told it by lamplight, how a mother who had lost her child chose fire over silence, how she turned Easter, the Master's day of resurrection, into a day of reckoning. In Virginia, where the Rawls plantation once stood, only ruins remained. Grass grew through the scorched bricks, and the swamp crept in year by year. Locals said no house would stand there again. Every attempt to rebuild ended in fire. By the 20th century, the site was a tangle of trees, but the soil stayed black, and travelers swore that on spring nights the air smelled of smoke. History books did not carry her name. The county archives remembered only the death of a white family and a disobedient cook. But memory lived elsewhere. Memory lived in the hush of cabins, in the ring shouts of the Gullah Coast, in the scars on backs that bore her story when lips could not speak it. Memory lived in the land itself, which refused to forget the night it was baptized with blood and fire. Today, her name flickers like embers pulled from ash. Margaret of Virginia, the woman who burned her master's house on Easter, who slew her oppressors and turned the holy day into a funeral pyre. She is a ghost in America's soil, a figure both feared and revered. The masters wanted her body to rot in shame. Instead, she became a myth that refused chains, and so the story does not end with her death. It ends where all true rebellions end, not in silence, but in legend. When the fields are quiet, when the swamp breathes heavy, some swear you can still hear her words, low, steady, unbroken. You burned us for centuries. Tonight we burned back.